Hello, and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about a super exciting topic in economics, and that is externalities. So all the goods we have been talking about this year, we've been assuming that when you consume that good or service, the only person affected by that is you. So that, if I go out and buy a loaf of bread, I use the loaf of bread, my consuming bread doesn't really affect anybody else. And then on the supply side, the cost that the firm incurs in order to produce a good is only paid for by that firm. Like nobody else, has to take on the cost that the firm does. So consumers, get all the benefits, and they only go to the person who consumes it, and producers pay the cost to produce goods, but only they face the cost of producing goods. That's not always the case. So a lot of times, as a consumer, if I consume something, it makes me better off for consuming it, but also my consumption of that good might create an effect for other people around me. So one example is education. So obviously, if I get educated, I learn to read, I learn calculus and statistics, obviously. I go to college, maybe I go to graduate school. All of that investment in education certainly helps me individually. It'll affect my job prospects and all sorts of stuff down the line. But a lot of people would argue that the benefits for education are not just to you personally, that education is important for a society to function. Like, we need people to be able to read, so that they can, read traffic signs and, communicate with each other in writing. And that, if we have a more educated society, we're going to be more likely to innovate new things and invent new things, so that, education is good for the individual, but there's also this external effect, this positive effect for society as a whole, which we call a positive externality. So an externality is an effect that either benefits or harms society at large, beyond just the individual effect that happens to the consumer or the producer. So another example of a good that creates positive externality are vaccinations. If you get vaccinated, let's say for the flu, yes, you personally are protected against getting the flu. But if a large enough percentage of the population is vaccinated, it actually ends up protecting people who are not vaccinated as well. The only way an epidemic can happen is if there's enough unvaccinated people for it to infect and get transmitted. Every time the flu runs into somebody who's vaccinated, it dies and can't get passed on. So if enough people are vaccinated in society, it also creates protection for people who are not vaccinated. That creates a positive externality for people who did not get vaccinated. So vaccines benefit the people who get them, but then they also create you call it herd immunity, that protects non-vaccinated people. So that benefit that non-vaccinated people are getting, that's a positive externality. As you might have guessed, if there are positive externalities, there can also be negative externalities. Classic example on the consumer side is smoking cigarettes. As somebody who is smoking, I'm now ancient and old enough to remember that there used to be a time when you could smoke in an airplane. When people are smoking in an airplane, I guess they're enjoying their cigarette, but it creates all this secondhand smoke that then everybody around them has to breathe in, and that kind of sucks. So that discomfort and cost that everybody around them is paying from having to breathe in their secondhand smoke, that's a negative externality of consuming the cigarette for the individual. On the producer side, similar situation. Just imagine a much bigger cigarette, is pollution, right? So, a firm has a factory, it's producing iPhones or whatever. The firm has to pay its workers, it paid for the machines, all that sort of stuff. So there are a lot of costs that the firm actually has to pay on its own. But then if it's polluting the skies, or the water or whatever, in the community where it is, the air quality and the water quality is going to affect everybody around it, and that'll be a negative externality. So it's a negative effect that people around the factory experience that the factory is not paying for. So those are some examples of negative externalities. Okay, so if consuming a good creates a positive externality, what do we think is going to happen? Is the market equilibrium that we settle down to, will we as a society be consuming too little of that good or too much of that good? So to think about that, and we're going to look at some actual examples of graphs. Let's say this is a demand curve, and this is a supply curve. So this is for the market demand. So a good that has a positive externality, what we'd say is that aside from just the individual demand curve for people who are consuming the good, there's a social demand curve this dotted line, that's actually higher. There's more demand because this good is creating a positive externality. So the value to society at large is actually, yes, what the individuals are getting, so here, but also an extra bonus because it creates this good effect for society. So you can imagine that we can envision a positive externality as creating a social demand curve or value curve that's higher than what the actual individuals who are consuming the good face. But in this situation, the market equilibrium is right here. You know, this is like 12 units, price of $20 or something like that. This is where the market would land. Socially, from society's point of view, this would be the optimal amount. So because this positive effect isn't being taken into account in the market, we're actually going to land at a lower equilibrium quantity than society would like us to have. If we actually took into consideration the positive externality and the value that it's adding to society, we would actually want to consume more of it. So goods that produce positive externalities, so positive externality, we're going to end up at an equilibrium that underproduces the good. And you can imagine for a negative externality, we can imagine that the social cost is higher than what the firm faces. So like if it's a factory and it's creating pollution, this might be the firm's actual marginal cost. But then socially, the costs we're facing are what the firm faces plus the cost of pollution. So the market would end up here. Let's just call that 40. So the socially optimal amount is less than that, because if we take into consideration the bad effects of pollution, we would want to be producing less. So without any interventions, goods that produce negative externalities will be overproduced. So we have too much of the bad stuff and not enough of the good stuff. Okay. So let's actually look at some numbers and some spiffier graphs. So here, this is an actual model of a positive externality. So the market demand is given by this equation here. It's the green line. And then the social demand curve, so the demand curve that takes into account the positive impact of the externality, that's the red dotted line. And we have a supply function given here, that's the blue line. So we can see that the market equilibrium that we would land at is right around here. But the socially optimum market equilibrium would be here at a higher quantity. So we can figure out what those numbers are. I'll let you go ahead and try this. You just need to set the green and the blue curve equal to each other to find the actual market equilibrium, and then you set the red dotted line and the blue curve equal to each other to solve for this socially optimal equilibrium. So you can go ahead and put that in play posit. Okay. This is how we model a negative externality. So this could be an example of a factory that's making pollution. Here, the firm's cost curve is this blue line. But the social cost curve is even higher. It's however much the actual factory or producer cost is plus the extra cost of pollution. So the market equilibrium that we would get to without any interventions is right here, but the socially optimal amount is right here. So I want you to go ahead and figure out what those two bundles are. So go ahead and put those in. So as it turns out, correcting externalities is another way where taxes and subsidies can come in handy. So here, if we look at this scenario, if we leave the market by itself, we will end up overproducing this good. We'll be producing 200 units, and that's more than the socially optimal amount. So we could, if we wanted to try to move the market to point B instead of point A, we could impose a tax on the producer. And we could make the tax equal to the difference between the producer's cost curve and the social cost curve. So what that would do is it would actually shift the producer's cost curve up here. So if we actually tax them the amount that the pollution was costing society and actually impose that cost on the producer, that would shift up their cost curve and get us to point B. So notice that when we... Okay, so what I was saying... in a market where a producer is producing a negative externality for society that is not being held accountable for, you can think about that as if it's being allowed to impose a cost for free, right? So that's, in some ways, you can think of that as being a subsidy. Like a firm is being allowed to create a cost that they are not having to pay for. By taxing them, we can fix that and try to bring the market to the socially optimal amount, even if that point was not optimal for the firm. So here, the firm might lose out, might be worse off afterwards, but society will be closer to the optimal bundle that is best for society. For a positive externality, the government, for a positive externality, the market equilibrium that we get to will underproduce the good. We don't have enough of the good thing. So the government can go the other way and subsidize that good. So that's why, you see a lot of government programs that subsidize education or subsidize vaccinations, and those kinds of things that, create positive externalities for society. Even though that subsidy will create a deadweight loss, the social gain actually moves us closer to what's socially optimal. So that's another reason why taxes and subsidies exist, even if they sometimes create deadweight loss. And that's about it here. So I will talk to you soon. Thanks.